Welcome to Lesson 8 in this series covering American government and politics. The lesson has been created to support the teaching of A-Level politics. In this lesson, we consider factors affecting voting in Congress. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to answer the following questions. What influences how a member of Congress votes on legislation? How have the factors that influence congressional voting changed in recent times? What is the most important influence on congressional voting? Let's begin by looking at the first factor, party allegiance. It is almost impossible to be elected to Congress without representing one of the two major parties, and members of Congress will often vote with their parties. The parties are ideologically cohesive. Almost all Democrats consider themselves liberals, while all Republicans consider themselves conservatives. In 2023, roll call found that the average Democrat member of Congress voted with the majority of their party 95% of the time. Party line voting is particularly clear on ideological issues. These include issues such as abortion and immigration. Members of Congress are freer on non-ideological issues. Members of Congress can face primary election challenges from grassroots party members if they vote against their party on significant votes. For example, in 2022, Representative Liz Cheney of Wyoming lost the Republican primary election after voting with Democrats to impeach President Trump. However, on most votes, party allegiance is comparatively low. It is certainly much lower than in the United Kingdom. Members of Congress are much more able to vote against their parties where they have support in their states or districts. For example, Democrat Representative Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez voted with Republicans to block Biden's student debt relief plan, a step generally supported in her conservative district with a high proportion of non-graduates. Another example is Republican Senator Susan Collins of Maine. She is a pro-choice Republican and votes against the majority of her party on reproductive rights. However, Pew found 64% of Maine citizens are similarly pro-choice on abortion. Why is party allegiance low in Congress? There are a number of reasons for relatively low party allegiance. Firstly, the president and congressional leadership have little patronage. Due to separation of powers, there are no ministerial roles or favors that they can be offered in return for support. Secondly, there is no executive or other central control of the legislative process. This means that disloyal members of Congress can still be influential. And thirdly, party leaders have little central control over the selection of candidates. Candidates are selected in primary elections, so it is up to voters to decide if a disloyal member of Congress should remain in office. Now let's look at congressional party leadership. Each party has a leader and whip in each chamber of Congress. They are known as the Majority Leader and Majority Whip, or Minority Leader and Minority Whip. Their titles depend on which party has control. Congressional leaders attempt to create party cohesion, but have few formal powers to achieve this. Their influence is greatest as media spokespeople, particularly during periods where attention is on Congress. The Speaker chairs sessions in the House and is also the leader of the majority party. Their ability to appoint committee chairs and control the Rules Committee gives them significant potential power in the House. In periods of divided government, the Speaker will often become the unofficial leader of the opposition. Their power can be particularly high if the president is weak. Their power is less if the White House is controlled by their own party, as the president will drive the party's legislative agenda. Here are some examples of congressional leaders who have been able to exert some influence over their parties. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker, and Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, were influential during the Trump impeachments and 2018 government shutdowns. Paul Ryan was influential as Speaker during periods of divided government during the Obama administration. Newt Gingrich was similarly influential as Speaker during the Lewinsky scandal and Clinton impeachment. However, in general, the power of congressional leaders is limited. This is due to three reasons. Firstly, if their party controls the White House, it is the president who is seen as the national party leader. Secondly, as already covered, congressional leaders have few patronage powers. They cannot offer executive roles in return for support due to separation of powers. And finally, the equal status of each chamber of Congress means the influence of any single congressional leader does not extend beyond the Senate or House. For these reasons, prominent members of Congress who regularly side with their opposing parties are able to do so with relative freedom. Examples include Republican Senators Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, and Democrat Senator Joe Manchin. A third factor to consider in congressional voting behavior is personal and ideological belief. The weakness of party discipline and leadership means that members of Congress are much freer than in the United Kingdom to make decisions based on personal ideology and belief. This is reflected in congressional elections, where there is greater focus on the personal character and beliefs of individual candidates rather than the national party platform. Republican Senators Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski are good examples. They are both pro-choice Republicans who rarely vote with their parties on reproductive rights. However, on the whole, the personal beliefs and ideologies of members of Congress match those of their constituents. For example, Republican Senator Susan Collins is able to oppose her party's policy on abortion partly because 64% of the people of Maine are pro-choice. Members of Congress are likely to be voted out at primary or congressional elections if their personal beliefs do not coincide with their constituents. For example, Representative Jamal Bowman of New York lost the 2024 primary election because of his pro-Palestinian views. He was running in a district with a relatively high Jewish population. Pro-Israel interest group, AIPAC, also spent $15 million on unseating Brown. That was the largest amount ever spent in a primary. The views of constituents, and what Americans call pork, are also important factors. There is strong tradition that congressmen serve the interests of their constituents, what are sometimes referred to as the folks back home. Members of Congress are expected to have meaningful and long-term ties to their districts and states. Low incentives or penalties connected to voting against party leadership mean that members of Congress have significant freedom to side with their constituents. Biennial elections in the House mean that representatives have little time after winning office to start the process again of raising campaign finance, fighting challenges in primary elections, and running again for election. This often makes them keener to reflect the opinions of the folks back home. The potential dangers of voting against the wishes of the folks back home are evident. For example, Representative Jamal Bowman lost the 2024 New York primary election because of his pro-Palestinian views, and Representative Liz Cheney lost the 2022 Wyoming primary election because of her support for the Trump impeachment. Bringing home the pork. Members of Congress are also expected to serve their constituents by attracting federal spending for programs in their districts and states. Allocations of funding for such projects are formally called earmarks, but it is colloquially called pork. Members of Congress are expected to bring home the pork. Earmarks can be added to bills to gain support from specific members of Congress. For example, Senator Susan Collins secured $20 million in 2024 for building at Presque Isle International Airport in her state of Maine. However, members of Congress who consistently vote against their constituents' wishes are unlikely to last long in Congress. It is particularly important that members of Congress do not anger grassroots supporters of their own party, so to some extent, there is a balancing act between constituents, party, and personal beliefs in making a decision. Members of Congress who exploit earmarks are often called out in the news media. This can be embarrassing, particularly for Republicans who otherwise argue for limited government. Congressional caucuses are another possible influence on voting behavior in Congress. Caucuses are groups of members of Congress formed around a specific issue or interest. The largest are the party caucuses, the Republican and Democrat Party caucuses. They will meet to develop party legislative strategy. However, aside from party caucuses, influential caucuses are rare. Members of Congress, on the whole, tend to join caucuses that promote issues that they either already support or that are concerns in their districts or states. Caucuses serve three functions. They are educational, by providing members with policy briefings on relevant issues. They help to set agendas by coordinating action on an issue. For example, they might organize caucus members to co-sponsor a bill. They can also gather support by encouraging members of Congress to vote in support of caucus priorities. There are four broad types of caucus. Firstly, there are the party caucuses consisting of the main parties. Secondly, there are interest caucuses. For example, the Sneakers Caucus campaigns to have congressional shoe regulations relaxed. It has gained some publicity. Thirdly, there are racial caucuses. The Hispanic Caucus and the Black Caucus, for example, have been influential on race relations issues. The Hispanic Caucus, for example, has been successful in campaigning for the rights of migrants and vaccine equity. Finally, there are ideological caucuses. For example, the House Freedom Caucus is a right-wing, Trump-supporting Republican caucus. The House Freedom Caucus has been very influential on Republican Party leadership in Congress. In 2023, the Freedom Caucus blocked the election of Kevin McCarthy as Speaker until he granted concessions. Then in 2024, the caucus pushed McCarthy out of the Speaker role entirely. While the House Freedom Caucus has been very influential, it is a bit of an anomaly. However, caucuses vary in their influence. Many have mainly educational aims. Others exist because members of Congress want to work on issues that are relevant to their districts or states. For example, Lori Chavez DeRemer of Oregon is chair of the Sneakers Caucus. Oregon is where the Nike HQ is located, and so an interest in sneaker production is not surprising. Representatives Barr and McGarvey from Kentucky chair the Bourbon Caucus. Again, this reflects their constituents' interests since bourbon is made in Kentucky. Ideological caucuses can be more effective, but the House Freedom Caucus is an anomaly, and it is rare that caucuses have such influence. Members of Congress can be subject to significant influence by interest groups. Interest groups, known as pressure groups in the UK, will use a variety of tactics to try to influence members of Congress. These include contact by professional lobbyists. For example, the NRA spent $2.2 million on lobbying in 2020. Phone calls, emails, and letters. Rallies, demonstrations, and petitions. Testifying at committee hearings and providing campaign finance. For example, AIPAC spent $15 million to successfully unseat Representative Jamal Bowman of New York in the 2024 primary election because of his pro-Palestinian views. The average Republican senator received $6,750 in campaign donations from the NRA during the 2020 election cycle. Interest groups will also produce congressional scorecards showing the proportion of times a member of Congress has voted in favor of their issues. For example, Senator Susan Collins has a rating of 70% from NARAL, a pro-choice interest group. However, interest groups tend to support candidates who are already sympathetic to their agendas, due to their personal beliefs, their party allegiance, or both. For example, the NRA donates almost exclusively to Republican candidates. The White House will also try to influence the votes of members of Congress. The president will often try to influence members of Congress to vote in favor of their legislative agendas. He can do this in several ways. He can make legislative proposals in the State of the Union address. He can use the publicity of the bully pulpit to call for action using press conferences, speeches, social media posts, and so on. The president can personally lobby himself or lobby through the Executive Office of the President, the Office of Legislative Affairs, and through cabinet members and their staffs. The president is able to offer some perks to members of Congress, such as rides in Air Force One or visits to Camp David, the president's ranch. Statements of administration policy, or SAPs, can be useful in influencing Congress. These are statements explaining the president's opinion on a bill, and if he is likely to exercise the veto. Finally, the president can also exercise influence through the veto. Each of these legislative tactics available to the president will be examined in later lessons focusing on the president. However, the president's influence on Congress varies significantly. It is at its highest during periods where government is not divided. Presidents are more likely to be successful with Congress when his party controls both chambers. For example, President Obama's success with bills he supported fell from 96% in 2009 to 57% in 2011, after the Democrats lost the House. Influence is also highest at the start of an administration. Presidential influence over Congress falls with time. For example, President Obama's success with bills he supported fell from 96% in 2009 at the start of his first administration to 39% in 2016 at the end of his second administration. Finally, influence is highest when the president has a high approval rating. Approval ratings measure the president's popularity with the public. Popular presidents are more likely to influence Congress. Again, these factors will be considered in later lessons focusing on the president's power over Congress. In summary, there are a number of influences on the voting behavior of members of Congress. These include party allegiance, congressional party leadership, personal ideological belief, the views of constituents, and pork, congressional caucuses, interest groups, and the influence of the president in the White House. Later lessons will examine this last factor, the ability of the president to influence the legislative process.